Hello, I'm Elaine Petrocelli from Book Passage, the independent bookstores in San Francisco's Ferry Building and in Corte Madera, California, and online at www.bookpassage.com. And I especially want to thank everyone who has stood with us since 1976 and those who have come along since we opened, and especially those who've been so supported since the pandemic. We did our first online interview on April 6, 2020, and now we have done hundreds, and you've all been there with us, buying books, supporting us with donations, buying gift cards, and donating to our giving tree, where we send books to thousands of children who would never have a book of their own without us. So thank you all for being here. I need to tell you that I worked really hard to convince Jennifer Rubin to come this evening. I really didn't have to work that hard, but my friend Sue Wallach, who I knew knows Jennifer Rubin, stepped up and said, don't worry, I'll ask her. And so between Jennifer's wonderful publisher and Sue Wallach, here we are tonight, and I am really delighted. As you all know, Jennifer Rubin is a journalist and opinion writer for the Washington Post. And over time, I have been following her opinions, and like many people, her opinions have changed. I remember when she wrote for commentary on the Weekly Standard, and I used to get angry every time I read something. Is it right to get angry with people who don't agree with you? I always learn something, and that's still going on. I'm just so happy that this woman, who has had a successful career as an attorney and then became a journalist, has stepped up to write what really is the story of the women since Donald Trump was elected. This book, Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump, is something you want in your library. As I read it, I thought I remembered everything about the last 5 years. And yet every time I read something else, I thought, oh my goodness, there's something else I've forgotten. This is really an important book, and I think you'll see that as we talk tonight. Jennifer, I'd like to start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you felt going up to the 2016 election.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Sue, for reaching out, and Elaine for making this possible, and all the folks at Book Passage. One of the great delights of writing a book is that you get to spend a lot of time with independent booksellers, who I think are the heart and soul of America's intellectual life. So it's always a pleasure to do one of these programs. I think in this respect, I didn't have any secret insight or secret sauce that any of you were lacking. And I was just as shocked and just as troubled, just as traumatized in some sense as the rest of you likely were when Donald Trump prevailed. And going back to 2015, when he first rode that golden escalator down in his building, I had always held out hope that first that his party would stop him, and then that the voters would figure out who this fellow was and deny him the presidency. And of course, that didn't happen. And that experience of being caught so unaware and being so disappointed and shocked in the voters' choice, I soon discovered in writing the book was a very common emotion. And it was perhaps the emotional bond that brought many women from diverse backgrounds, diverse ideologies together in figuring out how to cope with this phenomenon. So the stories that I tell at the beginning of the book of people sitting around on election eve were just emblematic, I think, of thousands, millions perhaps of women who were going through the same sort of experience.
But then things started to happen. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, for example, the inauguration, that horrible inauguration. And
Yes.
As a journalist, how did it feel to be covering that?
Well, things did start right away, as it were. And although we all remember the Women's March, which took place, if everyone recalls, the day after the inauguration, what happened between the election and the march, as I discovered in talking to many, many women for the book, was a very quick processing of what happened, considering the trauma, the surprise, the shock. People cycled through that fairly quickly. And immediately women began doing what women always do, which is reach out to other women and begin talking, begin sharing, begin trying to process, trying to understand what happened. And well in advance of the inauguration, women started networking. They began talking in churches, at synagogues, at their bookstores. They had people who maybe were tangentially interested in politics and suddenly wanted to know a lot more, wanted to know what they could do. And it was a very organic process. Some of these networks were made up of people who had never worked on a campaign, never donated $1 to a campaign. And others were made up of people who perhaps had been more active earlier in their lives, had then become busy with careers and family. But this was a call to arms, as it were. And so by the time we got to the election, an awful lot had already happened below the surface, under the surface. I think for me, that those couple of days were just stunning to me. We all remember now probably the most on point thing he ever said. George W. Bush, after listening to that inaugural speech, said, "That is some weird, blankety blank." And I think we all felt that way. It was sort of an out of body experience. It was so bizarre, it was so dark. It was so unpresidential, that I think anyone who had held out hope, however unrealistic, that somehow he would grow into the job or he would see the majesty of the office, he would want to do well, was quickly disabused of the fact that he was going to be anything other than what he was, which is a very dark, very scary individual. And I think that in some ways set the bar, set the tone for much of what followed. But like many of us, we went through this kind of whiplash after sitting through that inaugural speech and thinking, oh my gosh, what has happened to our country? The next day was simply joyous. It was inspirational, uplifting, awe-inspiring, still regarded as the largest single day of protest in American history, considering all of the protests for all the various causes. That's a remarkable thing. And it's even more remarkable that the day after a presidential inauguration, that many people could organize themselves either in their hometowns, where there were hundreds of these mini marches, if you will, back home, but also hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. And it was interesting in talking to many women who are part of very established organizations, Emily's List, NARAL, members of Congress. They didn't quite know what to make of this because they were not involved in this. This was also a very grassroots endeavor. And for weeks, they did not believe that this was going to amount to much of anything. And when, I talked to these women, they kind of sheepishly acknowledged, we didn't know anyone who was working on it. We didn't anticipate that it was going to be of this, magnitude. And I think when it then happened, it was not simply, oh gosh, look at all the people we can turn out. I think it was an emotional catharsis and a realization for women that they were not alone, that if it was not simply them, it was not simply their network of friends that had gotten together after the election, but they were not alone. And that in mass numbers, they had power. And that is, of course, the key to any citizens movement. That's the key to any grassroots movement, is the realization that as a citizen, you have power, you have control over your lives. And if you will, the election of Donald Trump and the inauguration was something in which people felt very powerless. They felt very much confused, very much adrift. And here was the first step towards taking back control of their country, taking back control of their lives. And I don't want to say that the whole resistance would have been impossible without it, but I think it would have taken a very long time to get underway had it not been for this very dramatic event. And if you'll remember, it was just a weekend later that the airports were deluged with people when the so-called Muslim ban went into effect. And here were people who watched what was happening on TV, literally got up off their couches, drove to airports, turned out in hundreds of airports by dozens, hundreds, lawyers who had expertise in these areas got going. Civil rights groups got going, the newly found Indivisible, this huge network of most of the progressives turned out. And that also told me something. That told me that the march was not a one-shot deal, that this was a beginning, not simply a statement or a spasm of objection. And that if you could turn that many people out, and that many people felt emotionally engaged without someone calling them on the phone and telling them what to do, but they could do this of their own initiative, then this was something that was really going on. There was something special afoot. And I think in that week, although I clearly understood that we had a very dark, difficult road ahead, I think I began for the first time to see that, one election is not a permanent death sentence for a democracy. And if you have people who are engaged, if you have people who are motivated and who have a certain skill set, then I think it's possible to redirect an entire nation. And I do want to emphasize that women often, unlike their male counterparts, are filled with second guessing. I don't have the expertise. I've never done this before. I don't know how to run for office. Don't you have to have a PhD in political science? I had a very amusing interview with Stacey Abrams, the wonderful voting rights activist. And she said, men wake up one morning, fall out of bed, have a good hair day, and decide they're going to run for president. They don't feel this need for credentials, for justification, for explanation. They simply have something to say and they're going to go do it. And I think so many women realized you don't need to be a politician to do this. If you have professional experience in whatever career you've done, if you've ever attended a PTA meeting, if you've ever run a family, you have the basic organizational skills to work with people, to communicate with people, to lay out a game plan. And the skill set that they brought was more than sufficient to get themselves going, get themselves off the ground. And when I spoke to first-time candidates, that batch of remarkable women who ran for Congress in 2018, who had never run for political office, did not think of themselves as political. Many of them had national security background. Many of them had, for example, worked at the CIA. They went to some of their town halls and met some of the incumbents in their district, and they came away firmly convinced that these people were not up to the task, that they could do a better job. And that realization that you can do it, that politics is not what other people do. Politics does not require some secret sauce, some special expertise, some refined skill set that a determined, educated, informed citizen can do this too. I think was a great awakening for people. And I hope that hasn't been lost. I hope people remember that as we see challenges ahead, that politics is a participatory sport. This is not for spectators, and democracies don't run themselves. They depend upon an active citizenry.
Well, I think one of the things that the march did was make us realize, A, we weren't alone,
Yes.
and B, we better get off our chairs and do something. I in your book, you quote Nancy Pelosi as saying they marched and then they ran and they voted. And I think that's really an important point, that I just hope the voting will be allowed to continue. I don't know where we are on that. Do you want to talk about the
Sure.
voting?
I think, there is concern. I have the concern, others have the concern that people are fatigued, understandably so. For 4 or 5 years, people emotionally, personally, financially engaged in the resistance, in this battle to preserve democracy. Then they were hit with COVID, and they spent a year or more, and many people trying to educate their kids at home and work and deal with all of the logistical traumas. And people are tired, and they feel like they need a break from the world. They're just now getting their feet back on the ground. People who thank goodness now have access to vaccines for themselves and their children can finally have some peace of mind, send their kids back to school full time, plan out their lives. But now we turn around to them and say, oh, we're not quite done. We need you some more. We need you again. And that is the demands of democracy. She's a very greedy mistress, if you will, that deserves and demands constant attention, constant, I think, reaffirmation. And that's what it takes. Ronald Reagan, whatever you thought of him, or whatever you agreed or didn't agree, had a very remarkable insight, and that is we're always one generation away from losing our democracy. And I don't think any of us really believed that until this event happened. I always, go back to, as a college student, as a young adult, as an avid reader of history, we always attributed to the Europeans this dangerous flirtation with authoritarianism, whether it was the 20th century, whether it was the age of absolute monarchs, that they always had this, sort of tangential, relationship with power, and that they were perhaps vulnerable to very ideologically extreme movements. But it was hard to comprehend that Americans were too. And that's another revolution, and another revelation that we had was that someone who has a sort of feral intelligence, an ability to perceive people's darkest impulses, the ability to see people's vulnerabilities, could tap into the very worst elements, the most extreme elements in America, and really bring us to the brink, it turned in January 6th, of a constitutional crisis. And that too was a revelation, and it has sent many of us in the pro-democracy movement, if you will, scrambling to, come up with some institutional protections so that if, God forbid, he comes back or someone like him comes back, there will be enhanced guardrails for democracy, that there will be a greater separation between the Justice Department and the White House, that presidential pardons will be scrutinized more closely, that political corruption and receipts of foreign monies, the so-called emoluments clause, will have an enforcement mechanism to prevent presidents from falling under the sway of foreign powers. So I think there are many institutional fixes and concerns that people now are working on. Adam Schiff, congressman from California, is among those who has a terrific piece of legislation that is focused on many of these issues. But of course, the underlying problem remains, and that is how deeply committed are we as a people to democracy? How willing are we to put up with the frustrations, the occasional dysfunction of democracy? How committed are we to overcoming whatever ideological policy differences we have in order to maintain the fundamental building blocks of democracy, which include independent courts, the rule of law, the sanctity of elections? And for those of us who thought that the worst was behind us when we got rid of Donald Trump and when Biden and Harris finally took the oaths of office, I think these last months again have been an eye-opener, that the ability to undermine elections, the ability to gaslight tens of millions of Americans who continue to say that the president was not elected, that somewhere out there was some devious plot, should be a reminder that there is no substitute for really active engagement by people across the political spectrum who have differences on a host of subjects, but who simply won't tolerate an erosion of democracy and the ascension of someone who is, for all intents and purposes, a cult leader and rules through fear and irrationality and prejudice. And that remains the central task, I think, for Americans.
Speaking of cult, I remember, I can't quote it right now, but Lindsey Graham said something like that during the campaigns of 2016 about how Donald Trump really needed to go to hell, as I recall. And so many other Republicans who we thought were seeing the light seem to be slavishly saying things that I can't even believe that their mothers speak to them. It's truly horrifying what the Arizona senator, congressman today, who sent out a meme of really awful things about AOC. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I am really fascinated in the worst possible way as to how that happens. What are they afraid of? What does he have on them?
Yes. You know, it is a fascinating phenomenon. And every time I have an opportunity to talk to a congressman, congresswoman in a off-the-record setting, I ask the same question. Do these people believe what they are saying? And if you take the House, for example, which has more than 200 Republicans, they almost invariably say about 50 of them actually believe this. They're nuts. They have absorbed a stream of propaganda. They live in a bubble. They have become conspiracy theorists. They have really lost touch with reality. But that's only 50 of them. What about the rest of them? What are they doing? And you know, for a while we thought, well, maybe they simply want to get through the next election cycle. Maybe they just want to make sure that whatever they want for their district isn't relegated to the back room. Maybe this is kind of transactional, that they really are simply trying to maneuver around a president who they know to be unfit, but who they feel some obligation to manage to maneuver around. But what's the explanation once he's gone? This has persisted. And I come around to two fundamental explanations for what has happened. The first is, if you will, a sociological, tribal, psychological explanation, that these people are a member of a tribe that has a certain set of guidelines, a certain set of ground rules. They simply cannot imagine being outside the circle of people, this circle of belief, and they have acclimatized themselves to the group. This is the cult phenomenon. the desire to belong is so strong that you will depart from rationality, from experience, even from self-interest in order to retain your ties to the group. And it's been remarkable, but I think it is a sociological / psychological attachment to your group. And in a very polarized American political environment, people feel absolutely petrified to be excluded from their group. And so they cling to it. They will rationalize, they will come up with insane explanations to keep them where they are. And the other explanation, sadly to say, is that many politicians do not go into public office for the right reasons. Many of these folks, I'll be blunt, this is just us talking, that they could not in a million years find a position other than what they have that would give them the same respect, the same attention, the same visibility as they now enjoy as a member of Congress, whether in the Senate or the House. And they are petrified of losing that spot. They will make a bargain with the devil, no matter what it is, in order to retain their position. And you and I might say, well, what are they so afraid of? Why don't you do something good? And what's the worst that can happen? You lose your office and you go out and you get a job doing something else. That is the worst possible result for them. And sadly, we have, and I think this began to reverse itself, frankly, because of Donald Trump. We've come to a point where, to quote Donald Trump, they don't send the best of them to hold political office. We've made it very unpleasant, frankly, to hold political office. The desire, the need for constant fundraising, the angry in political environment, the social media involvement, make it very disagreeable for many people to go into public life. And when you see people turning down the opportunity either to return to public life or to go into the Washington, D.C. maelstrom, you realize that something really has gone awry. Just today, the Republican governor, who's actually been quite progressive, quite effective, Sununu, who is of the Sununu family, a very prominent family in New Hampshire, said, I'm not going to run for Senate. That's the worst possible position. Who wants to do that? And so the quality of people that we get now in Congress is not high. It is not, there are no Daniel Websters. There are not even Howard Bakers in the Senate and the House. And so I think this combination of a relatively low quality of lawmaker and this tribal instinct has caused these people to behave in ways that are entirely irrational, very often in their own, to the detriment of their own self-interest, and yet they perpetuate this behavior. And all of this is reinforced by a very strong conservative media bubble that insulates them from reality. And you can understand how strong this is when one of them gets into a debate, or Donald Trump get into a debate, and suddenly they're arguing about some obscure theory or some obscure set of facts that we don't have any idea of. And that's because that's not of the real world. That's of the right-wing media world in which they operate, in which Dr. Seuss books and Big Bird become threats to, existential threats to America. And we all laugh at it, but this is what they marinate in. This is the environment. And imagine, you're on a desert island, which in some sense they are, and the only information you have about anything that's happening beyond your vision, or even any insight into what is happening in your own life, comes from a source that is designed, frankly, to make you angry, to make you insecure, to make you fearful, to keep you at a fever pitch. you too would become, I think, mesmerized and lose some grounding in reality. And tragically, we've seen what's happened with COVID. It's not simply a matter of will you believe the election is stolen? This is a matter of will you endanger yourself and your children because these people are telling you it's all a hoax or terrible things will happen from a vaccine. And if you operate in that environment, you eventually lose touch with reality. And startling as it may seem, we have one political party that is not really grounded in reality anymore. And that is extremely problematic. The right-wing media sort of bubble, which is operated cynically, purely for profit. Do we think Rupert Murdoch believes all this stuff? No, but he makes a lot of money operating Fox. That has become a serious impediment to American democracy. And that's before we even get to the social media problem as well.
And now that we have so many more women in Congress, one of the things that you point out in the book is that more Republican women, certainly not an equal number, it's still a tiny percentage of the guys in the suits, but there are more Republican women in Congress than there were before. I'm only aware of the ones who I consider the absolute crazies. Are there some new Republican congresswomen and senators that might not be part of the cult?
Well, that would certainly be nice. And I do detail in the book that in a very roundabout way, sort of a bank shot, if you're thinking in billiard terms, that Donald Trump finally gave a boost to Republicans to elect more women. And I think it sort of went like this. Donald Trump set off or sparked a revolution by which an enormous number of Democratic women ran for office in 2018. And if you have a lot of women running for office, a lot of them are going to be reelected. And I document in the book that Republican women looked at this and they said, this is nuts. If we can't get our act together, they're going to, the imbalance between representative women in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party is simply going to expand. And quite frankly, the Republican male leadership was not that interested in solving this problem. And women and women's PACs on the Republican side had to raise their own money, had to kind of elbow their way into races. And just as Democratic women, if you run in large numbers, some of you are going to get elected. It turned out to be a stronger election year than most anticipated for the House. And a great many of them did get elected. Now, you point out quite correctly that some of the worst, unfortunately, are Republican women, and we all can, identify those. There are Republican women who ran, if not distancing themselves from Donald Trump, certainly not aping that role model. I point to Michelle Steele, for example, who is a Republican representative in Southern California. And she ran, if you will, as kind of a normal Republican. The difficulty that those people have had is that if you now look at their voting records, it's essentially the same as the Marjorie Taylor Greenes. They voted against impeachment. They voted against the American Rescue Plan. They voted against infrastructure. They have simply become, cogs in this MAGA machine. And so the question is, for those women who ran on a somewhat independent, somewhat normal position in districts that had been blue seats, in other words, they had flipped the seats, are they really going to be able to hold them in 2022 when suddenly their voting record is now up for scrutiny? And I think Democrats are looking at those seats very carefully. Many of the seats that did flip from blue to red in 2020 were won by women. And so I think you're going to see, first of all, some rematches. Some of those battles were one woman against another woman. And I think the Republican who was an incumbent is now going to try to come back and challenge. And I think you're going to see those as some of the most contested, most hotly disputed seats that you have out there. One of the sad phenomenon about politics is that when one party overreaches and they then lose an election, it's not the hardcore crazies who lose. Those people are generally in gerrymandered districts or in very red states. They survive. It's the sane ones, if you will. It's the more moderate ones, the more reasonable ones who get leveled. And I can point to a district in which I used to live in Virginia, the Virginia 10th, for a number of years. I think she was at that point a 2 or 3 term Congresswoman, Barbara Comstock. It's a very normal, run-of-the-mill Republican representative. She had voted against repealing Obamacare, for example. She had been sort of a Mitt Romney kind of Republican. Come 2018, she gets obliterated. Is the Republican Party improved by the absence of her and the addition of Marjorie Taylor Greene? I don't think so, but that's a reality of politics, that when you have these surges, these swing elections, it is often people closest to the center who are the victims, if you will, of the political vicissitudes. And I would point that we have an even bigger problem in this regard coming up, and that is redistricting. That as we go through this redistricting process, politicians are self-interested. They will draw lines wherever possible to increase their representation, and more importantly, to make Republicans in absolutely safe seats. And it's remarkable. You would think, well, they're going to create a whole bunch of possible districts in which Republicans could win. That's true, but actually their highest priority is their own seat. And they will do whatever it takes to make their own seat absolutely safe for them. And that means more extreme candidates. That means Republicans who are not held accountable for their actions because they've chosen the electorate that is designed to support them. And so we have that pattern reinforce itself again and again. And that is why in this battle for voting reform, redistricting has become such a hot button issue. Now, some states have tried commissions. Some of them have not worked out. Some of them have. We're going to have a lot of fights over redistricting. Some of those will wind up in the courts. And I think people underestimate the power of gerrymandering to polarize and to radicalize our politics, that by choosing voters who are never in a million years going to vote for the other party, these people essentially solidify themselves in power. And worse, they become paranoid about challenges from the more extreme ranks. So a Republican no longer has to worry about losing to a Democrat in the general election. His or her big concern is being beaten from the right because they're in such a Republican district. And so someone not inclined to be radical, not inclined to parrot the Trump line, suddenly will sound like a lunatic because he or she is afraid of being primary. And that is a very disagreeable cycle that I think will not be broken until we are able to work our way through and either legislative or by court means put some limits on redistricting, on gerrymandering.
Well, women did the impossible after 2016. What we were told was impossible. I think we were told that we had to be nicer to the white guys who voted for Trump, that maybe we need to embrace them and understand them better. I think that women taught us something else. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, for example, saving ACA. I mean, I thought it was going to die, but it
absolutely
didn't.
Absolutely. One of the stories that I love telling, and I learned a lot myself from it, was There was obviously a multi-layered fight to preserve the Affordable Care Act. If you had told Democrats the day after the election, you've lost the presidency, you've lost the House, you've lost the Senate, but at the end of 4 years, you're still going to have an Affordable Care Act, most of them would not have believed it. And when you think about it, it was an extraordinary feat when you have completely unified government on one side. Remember, the Republicans for years had been running on repealing Obamacare. So what happened? How did Democrats pull this off? And really, it was an interesting inside-outside game. On the outside game, this was the first major fight that the group Indivisible had become engaged in. This was a group started by a husband and wife team who, with a simple Google Doc sent out to a bunch of their friends, stimulated a mass movement of individuals with very strong community ties, very willing to participate in the political process, to march, to protest, to contact their representatives. And they deployed their forces very carefully and very strategically. When a congressman gets a form letter from somebody outside his district, he's not going to pay any attention to it. When people from his district are suddenly sitting in his office or are writing individual letters, that makes a difference. That makes them think twice and three times. And so what the Indivisible folks understood is, although the issue may be national, the pressure on representatives has to be local. It has to be based in that district. It has to be fine-tuned to that district's needs. So, for example, in a district with a lot of people who enjoy Medicaid benefits that were essentially going to be cut in the same piece of legislation, they could go to a congressman and say, oh, by the way, you got 12,000 people in your district who are going to lose Medicaid benefits. And all of them and their relatives are going to come after you if you vote for this thing. So that was the outside game. It was this mobilization, this direct action pinpointed at congressmen and senators who they thought they might influence. The inside game then was essentially run out of a think tank and a sister organization, a political action organization, the Center for American Progress. And that was headed by Neera Tanden, who has since gone into the administration. If you recall, she was rejected as the director of OMB because, get this, her emails, her tweets were too spicy, were too negative. This is from the party of Trump, but that's another story. But what she did was essentially assemble all of the constituency groups that she could find in the Democratic Party, whether it was labor, whether it was environmental groups, and basically got everyone on the same page. And her first bit of advice to them was, we do not negotiate. We do not take prisoners. If you start negotiating with Donald Trump, you will not only lose this, you'll lose everything else. Her insight was, you have to beat him. You have to beat him on the first thing that comes out of down the pike. And if we all hang together and we force them to take the most unreasonable position possible, we've got a chance to hold on to this. And that's exactly what happened. And by absolutely keeping every Democrat within the tent, they could then have the luxury, if you will, of going to find those few Republicans in the Senate who were going to make the difference. And there were some very, very brave Democratic senators who lost their seats primarily because of this and because of their vote in opposition to now Justice Kavanaugh. And people like Heidi Heitkamp, people who came from rather conservative states and lost them, but nevertheless they understood that how essential it was to hang on to the Affordable Care Act. The two groups, the inside game and the outside game, actually collaborated in a really interesting way. And I think Google Doc may be the untold story of the entire Trump administration, because once again, a Google Doc comes to the rescue. What Nira did was she took these mega figures, how many people would lose healthcare, how much more people would spend on healthcare. And she set her analysts at CAP to work on breaking this down district by district, state by state. And they created a Google Doc so that the indivisible people could look at this information and say, oh, look, in the state of Arizona, this many rural hospitals are going to lose a measure of compensation that they can live with. This many people are going to lose on Medicaid. This many people are going to find themselves priced out of the market. And then they could use that information in their direct action. So this was a fascinating display for me of, against all odds, that an inside-outside game, properly directed by very determined women, primarily, and Indivisible is about 75% women, pulled off an enormous political upset that really no one anticipated. And to this day, if you now see, Republicans are not running on repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That's a phenomenal achievement after how many years that was the only issue that they ran on, was repeal of the Affordable Care Act. So I think your comment about, being nice, being polite, waiting your turn, well, maybe if we can work something out, being very accommodating, that was not the time for this. And the other secret weapon, of course, it wasn't so secret, that the Democrats had, was Nancy Pelosi, who is, in my estimation, and I would include the great Sam Rayburn, the finest, the most effective Speaker of the House in the modern era. With virtually no room for error. Not only did she help pass the Affordable Care Act, she helped defend it. And now she has gotten through 2, and she will soon, I think, get through 3 major pieces of legislation for the Biden administration, which really do a great deal to reset the terms of individuals' relationship with government and the sort of benefits and guarantees that government is providing for working families, for the elderly, and for the poor. And I think, had any other person been in that position, I could see very dangerous things happen. And I must say, I've come to take her for granted. On any given issue, when people are agonizing, they're going to lose this, they don't have enough votes for this, I take a measure of comfort, and I have one rule in politics, and that is never bet against Nancy Pelosi. She will figure out a way. And one of the great thrills was interviewing her. And this is a person who kind of personifies empathetic leadership. She knows every single one of her members. She knows their family. She knows their district. She knows what they absolutely need and what they can afford to lose on. And her way of understanding and communicating with all of her members keeps them on the same page. She doesn't get by ordering people around. You can't order people around in this day and age in politics. People have their own funding source. People have their own bases of power. You have to cajole, you have to help, you have to relationship build, you have to reward, you have to praise. And she really personifies this style of leadership, and has been able not only to keep her group together, but also to elevate other women. She did something phenomenal after the 2018 election. With all of these freshman women coming into office for the first time, she put them as chairs of subcommittees. Now, to the average person, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but in Washington, that's a big deal. To have a freshman attain a position that incumbents, some of whom have many years of seniority, would like to have, means you are going out of your way to elevate people, because she understands the importance of putting women in positions of leadership and also putting people in national security positions. She has used these women on the armed services, on the intelligence committee, on now on the committee that's investigating January 6th, because she understands for women, this is very important to establish your own national security credentials. It's a dig at women that they're not weak enough, that they're not strong enough, that they, don't know enough about the military. Perceiving this, she has tried to address that problem. So I think when you're looking at the style of female leadership, I think she in many ways has absolutely personified the model for success. She owns her power. She doesn't apologize for it. She knows her material. She knows her people. And as she likes to say, she knows her power. She knows her people. And from that, she derives remarkable power and remarkable effectiveness. And I suspect, as she has often said, that she eventually will go off in the sunset and spend more time with her 5 kids and 9 grandkids. But when she leaves, that will be a huge hole for Democrats, for the House, and for the country. Because more than really any other figure, presidents come and go, presidents don't pass bills. House and Senate leaders really pass bills. And she has more than carried her weight and more than met the match that was Donald Trump.
Those of us who are in Northern California are especially happy to hear this. And speaking of Northern California, race is so much on our minds. And here we are with our absolutely fabulous vice president. Those of us who live in the Bay Area remember when she was raising funds to be the San Francisco district attorney. And she wasn't any different than she is now. She held her head high. She answered questions. Truly impressive. Woman with Indian and African American roots. And then to think that Karine Jean-Pierre was her chief of staff during the campaign, a Haitian American who was a lesbian. This could not have happened. The contrast between this and the Republicans. And yet one of our people who is with us tonight, Elizabeth Hendrickson, asked us, what about Isabel Wilkerson's framework for understanding Trump in relation to race and caste? It feels such as took place in 1930s Germany. And we'd love your wisdom on that.
It is deeply upsetting, deeply important that we not shy away from this issue. Donald Trump tapped into a vein of white nationalism and white resentment that many of us ignored, had minimized, thought was part of a different era. And he, because he is a sort of emotionally vicious individual and understands the seamier side of America because he is that seamier side, was able and is able to this day to exploit white fears, whether it's of immigrants, whether it's of the association of African Americans with crime, which is mythological, whatever it is. And of course, we shouldn't forget how grotesquely misogynistic he is as well, because he is focused on a certain demographic of white, non-college educated men who have felt threatened, who have lost their perch of power in American society, and they don't like it. And Donald Trump is telling them they are victims. He is telling them that they have been done wrong, and the people responsible for this are minorities, are women, are elites, or the media. And this has been a toxic brew that he has really spread throughout the country. And it is very difficult to address that issue at the same time you're addressing a myriad of other issues, ranging from the pandemic to the economy, to foreign issues, to climate change. And it remains a central facet of American life. This is the original sin in American society, is race. And we have to be able to, as people who are devoted to democracy, be able to make a stand for inclusive democracy, for a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy. That is the foundation of America. And the insistence that they have on defining only themselves as real Americans and other.
Going on. Uh-oh, I'm going to go do something to my phone real quick.
Is somehow alien, is do as well. And I think we need to remember two things. One is that a democracy is only a democracy if everyone participates in the democracy. That denying someone's voting rights in another state is a diminishment of our own democracy. That by attacking what they perceive as the weakest link, they undermine the entire entity, the entire enterprise of democracy. And secondly, that you really can't separate race from all those problems that I listed, that you cannot have a fully functioning economy if African Americans are disadvantaged, if the wealth gap and the income gap persists. You are not going to overcome COVID if certain communities are left behind in the vaccination program. So that by definition, we have to address race as we are solving these problems, that they are inextricably intertwined. And I think we have to be brave about this. We have to be candid about this, not about punishing people. This is not about a zero-sum game that certain people win and other people lose. This is about the project of saving American democracy. We are a diverse country. We are a country based upon an ideal, not on a religion, not on a race, not on a specific demographic explanation of who is an American. And if we give up on that, then I think solving all the other problems that I mentioned really becomes impossible. And that's the great challenge, I think, going forward, is to maintain our faith in a diverse democracy, to understand and appreciate that we are inextricably linked to the fate of other Americans, and that if we allow certain Americans to be picked off, to whether it's to be excluded from voting, whether it's to be disadvantaged in the economy, whether it's to be given diminished inferior education, the democratic project fails. And that remains the great challenge with Donald Trump, without Donald Trump. And that requires, in the words of the book, that we resist, that we keep engaged. That I hope is the great takeaway from the book, that we can do this, we know how to do this, and we must do this.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I need to say that we've only touched on all of the amazing history, knowledge, and personal. I felt that I knew Katie Porter in new ways, even though I watch her on television. I never knew how Elizabeth Warren had mentored Katie Porter, how one woman brought another woman up, or how a good man helped a woman. There are lots of hopeful things. I know that people are scared to death about how we're going to keep the Senate, and we did get a question about that. I know we ran out of time, but if you'd like to just talk about that for 1 minute, because I have a couple questions people wanted to know. What are we going to do?
Yes, it's going to be a challenging environment. It always is in the first midterm election when one side is captured the White House. I actually am somewhat optimistic on the Senate side. Just today, two of the preferred Republican candidates for the New Hampshire Senate seat to challenge Maggie Hassan, who's really been a terrific senator, begged out of the race. And that's a very positive sign, I think. We've also seen that in Pennsylvania, Republicans have got themselves mixed up with a character who has serious allegations of spousal abuse. Donald Trump is wading into many of these races to choose candidates that are going to have a very difficult time in the general election because they're unfit, they're wacky, they've said and done wacky things. So at this point, I'm less concerned about the Senate than I am about the House. The House is going to be a very difficult environment. There's going to be redistricting issues. There are going to be Republicans who pound home at these exaggerated cultural issues. And Democrats are going to have to do what they did in 2018, which is turn their people out. Republicans tend to vote very strongly in off-year elections, Democrats not so much. So it's going to be incumbent upon Democrats to maintain their enthusiasm, to select candidates wisely, as they did in 2018. If they're in a moderate district, to find moderate candidates who the electorate is going to be able to relate to. They are going to have to turn out those irregular voters. And if they do, I think they have a shot at keeping the House, but a lot's going to depend upon the economy, the economy, the economy. And that's generally what determines the fate of elections in American society and American politics. And much is going to ride on where the economy is a year from now. Much is going to ride on whether Americans are feeling the benefits of the programs that Biden has successfully passed. But it's going to be a tough road, and we'll have to see how savvy, how effective, how aggressive Democrats are. But I wouldn't give up. I think there's a path to victory there.
Resistance. That's what we really need to talk about, because Jennifer Rubin's book really lays out how women did what we did to save our democracy, and men too. And so thank you for this book that I think will be read and reread. And the thing about it is great history grounded in research, and yet so readable that I just hope that everyone will have a chance to read it. And Jennifer, thank you for writing this book. I know with all that you had to do, sitting down in your room, writing this important book. And we were saying before in the green room that we think we remember everything about the last years, but I thought I remembered everything about January 2020. And it wasn't until I read Jennifer's Resistance that I thought, oh, I'd forgotten that. But most of all, it helps us know what we need to do next. So thank you so much, Jennifer.
My absolute pleasure.
All of you for watching.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
Good night. And